The Law of the Sea Treaty briefing. Will U.S. sovereignty be lost?
We're here because it is legacy time, apparently, and the Bush administration is seeking to lay down some markers to show that it can indeed play well with others, regrettably through the Law of the Sea Treaty. I have 4 points, all of which support one theme, and that is that every reason the Senate has for not ratifying the Kyoto Protocol applies to LOST, but with more seriousness and urgency. These reasons that the Senate is choosing not to vote on Kyoto have nothing to do with President Bush refusing to sign the treaty, as is so often stated. Obviously, his predecessor administration signed it on November 12, 1998. He never rescinded that signature, as also commonly stated, as he did do with the International Criminal Court by unsigning the Rome Statute. There's nothing in the Constitution or law impeding the Senate from voting on the duly signed Kyoto today. Instead, the Senate has its own reasons, largely unspoken, for not pursuing Kyoto, and they presumably revolve around the fact that Kyoto offers a platform for various regulatory schemes, regimes we'd be forced to adopt in the name of compliance with Kyoto, and presumably out of fear of possible sanction by a supranational entity. I'm speaking for the Senate because we're not discussing the treaty, but this is a presumption. This applies to LOST too. Like Kyoto, LOST purports to regulate parties' land-based pollution. This is an issue of tremendous contention, and it shouldn't be. LOST, therefore, also provides a platform for various regulatory regimes, far-reaching regimes. The claims that LOST terms reject the idea of forcing us to adopt any laws contradicting our own is a red herring and is not the same as claiming that we can't be forced to regulate as the LOST Tribunal decrees, which is how LOST differs from Kyoto. LOST has a tribunal, one which has made clear in the Mox case that it will decide on its own what its scope and jurisdiction is, apparently ad hoc, for parties who subject themselves to its authority. We know this going in now. This and only this point further distinguishes the two pacts in my mind. For some reason, Kyoto is touted as a binding and enforceable treaty, though by its very terms it is no such thing. Read Article 18. Kyoto can be made binding if the parties choose to subject themselves to it through the amendment process. It was proposed by the Saudis in 2005. If you'd be interested to know, it was Europe who objected, not wanting to be held to their global warming breastfeeding. Apparently, without the U.S. on board, there's no need for a treaty to be made enforceable. At least Kyoto, and such the amendment was rejected. But ultimately, if we were to ratify Kyoto, presumably pursuant to Missouri versus Holland, we would find ourselves having it held against us and us only, but domestically and in U.S. courts. Which is to say, if we ratify LOST, we're in essence ratifying Kyoto, but with a more immediate prospect of having its terms imposed upon us. Remember, LOST does expressly govern land-based pollution, as the tribunal deems activities to be polluting. And this would impose upon us potentially regimes we have elected to not adopt through the legislative process. It is likely, in my mind, for this reason, that LOST enthusiasts, including last week, go to such great lengths to dismiss the very provisions that LOST expressly promises to impose upon us, likely with, as Frank referenced, the never-ending stream of actions before the tribunal. One of these enthusiasts, who testified before a panel last week, is also on record counseling LOST parties and the tribunal to exercise restraint in imposing the pact's authority until the U.S. is safely on board as a ratified party. I suggest that this reflects his true belief about the likely outcome should we ratify. This gentleman and others tell us that to take the land-based pollution provisions at face value is not warranted, as being overly technical, because they falsely insist that this language, which is clearly article language and is clearly mandatory language, shall mean shall, with accompanying provisions regarding its enforcement, is merely hortatory, which is absurd, as Frank pointed out last week. Preposterous, I believe was your word, and it was a good choice of words. There are two problems with the statement. First, it's patently untrue. You can find hortatory language in LOST's preamble, for example. I'll give you a suggestion. LOST promotes, quote, realization of a just and equitable international economic order. That was the case with the WTO agreement, too, as many of you know, whose nod to an objective of sustainability in the preamble was subsequently elevated by the dispute resolution body as having created an enforceable right, which is the second point regarding the transparently disingenuous claims that LOST land-based pollution provisions, which are mandatory and article language, would never be applied against us. The U.S. argued the very position that there is, in essence, no such thing as mere hortatory language. So in short, objectionable mandatory article language about land-based pollution is not mere hortatory language, which could not possibly be imposed upon us, as the Senate was told last week. Yet even were that false claim true, the U.S. is simply not in a position to suddenly claim that mere hortatory language is not the subject of enforcement. We're on record strongly claiming the opposite. In conclusion, if one believes we should reverse longstanding policy, both of the past two administrations who chose not to ask the Senate to ratify Kyoto, though there is nothing in Constitution or law requiring that, and to a decade of Senate inaction, and now suddenly choose to become subject to Kyoto-style terms, then submitting to the law of the Sea Treaty makes perfect sense. If you don't believe Kyoto is a good idea for America, then the consistent position is to oppose subjecting the U.S. to the law of the Sea Treaty. It's utterly inconsistent to be both opposed to Kyoto and in favor of LOST as written. Ratifying LOST, in essence, in effect, in practice, guarantees ratification of Kyoto's terms. The U.S. has signed over 400 treaties that the Senate has elected to not ratify. The number's too high, and that's a practice that must stop, but the number should not be lowered by ratifying the law of the Sea Treaty. It should remain among the 400. Thank you.
The Law of the Sea Treaty Briefing. Will U.S. sovereignty be lost?
For more information, log on to heritage.org.